I want to turn it over to our guest speaker. His name is Dr. Bruce Lyon, and Dr. Bruce Lyon is a professor of evolutionary ecology up at campus UCSC, and he's doing a lot of great research about many bird species that can be found within the park's boundaries. And I believe tonight he's going to be speaking to us about American coots. So without further ado, let's give Dr. Lyon a warm welcome and our utmost attention.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm gonna just get my PowerPoint up. And there we go. Everybody can hear me okay? Yes, thumbs up. Good. All right, perfect. Yes, I'm going to be talking about that iconic redwood bird, the American coot. Actually, I was torn between talking about golden crowned sparrows, which may be more familiar to many of you, or coots. Coots are found, they're sort of thinly spread in the county, but in any sort of wetland. So they're really common throughout Western North America. A lot of little local ponds are right in town in Santa Cruz at Westlake Pond. And I figured I'd talk about them because they're actually, to my mind, a little even more interesting than the sparrows. They're just so bizarre. And this is the theme of this talk is really to sort of take another look at something we take for granted. I've talked to birders before, and when I've told them that I work on American coots, I actually had birdwatchers burst out laughing. Like, why the hell would anybody work on such a stupid, boring bird? And I hope by the end of the talk, you'll realize that they may look boring, but man, they are pretty interesting. And it's true about almost anything you look at. If you have good natural history skills and you start looking at things, you will discover interesting things. And so this is sort of a talk about much of my research career with this bird and just making unexpected discoveries all along the way. I had no idea they were so interesting. And I'll start early with this. It took a village to study the village idiot, the coot, including a very important person, Dai Shizuka. I'll talk about his work. He was a grad student. And it's hard to actually work on these birds in terms of getting lots of data. So you can see that long list of field assistants to the lower left. And then this work was done in British Columbia, and several ranchers allowed us to work on their land. So that was pretty amazing, and it made all the difference. So this is a bird that's a joke. Everybody's heard about the coot because if you call someone an old coot, it's an insult. Just like Rodney Dangerfield, I can tell that there's people my age attending tonight, so you're familiar with the famous comedian Rodney Dangerfield, who had a skit, "I don't get no respect." And I sort of feel like the coots are the Rodney Dangerfield of the bird world. They don't get no respect. And if you go, this is a quote from, this slide shows sort of a quote from one of the dictionaries. In addition to the fact that a coot is a variety of different birds, it's also an insult. If you call someone a coot, it's basically they're stupid and dumb. And I hope that by the end of the talk, you'll realize that if somebody calls you an old coot, you can take that with pride. It's like, whoa, I've got a lot of hidden skills and complexity here that people didn't really realize. So this is considered the coot. This is what a lot of people think about is like they're common. Bird watchers often don't like common things. I once asked someone if they saw anything, they went birding. Do you see anything? Nope. Anything interesting? Nope. Just a bunch of coots, implying that was a wasted day bird watching. They're pests, as this photo of a bunch of coots on a California golf course show. Basically, a lot of people, when they say, what are coots good for? They're good for feeding predators. This is not my photo. I will attribute photos that are not my own to the photographer. So if there's no name, it means I took the photo. And above all, coots are boring. Basically, if you go bird watching and you see coots, it was a bad day because you didn't see anything interesting. I hope by the end of the talk, when you reconsider the coot, everything I've told you is true. They're dirt common, they're pests, they're good for feeding predators, but I hope to convince you that they're extremely interesting, that there's a lot more beneath the surface when you open the hood and look at a coot in detail. I got interested in coots by a complete accident, and it had to do with a day off in the field in British Columbia working on a duck project, wading into a marsh and finding a baby coot and just being shocked at what I saw. So for those of you that are naturalists, this is what baby birds are supposed to look like. These are gulls, and a self-respecting baby bird does not call attention to itself because they get eaten by everything. So these baby gulls are camouflaged and doing their best impression of a rock. When I first discovered the baby coot, what was shocking to me was baby coots are not cryptic. They are almost tacky. They are colorful. They have these incredible bright beaks and colorful plumages and bald pates, just like mine, that change colors. This is anything but a camouflage baby bird. And when I found my first baby coot, I just realized that these are weird birds. This ain't natural. Well, it is, but it's not supposed to be. So that's sort of was my entryway into realizing that coots are up to something pretty bizarre. And so a series of natural, so then I decided to do my PhD work on coots. And once I was in the field, I made other sort of discoveries that kept capturing my attention. Within a couple of weeks of studying coots, I discovered several things. They beat their kids up nonstop. Most birds do not beat their kids up. This is a photograph of a coot punishing its chick, but it's not eating it, it's punishing it, it's spanking it. This is curious. Coots fight all the time. I'm from Canada and my favorite sport is hockey, and fights break out all the time. So I just sort of think of coots as the hockey players of the bird world. They just fight nonstop. Seriously, they fight more than a lot of other birds. And that's kind of an intriguing evolutionary question. I realized there was a whole nother rich layer, and right on the spot, my intercept, I just got to notice that my internet is a bit unstable. So when I see that sign, I will stop. I discovered that females were laying eggs in each other's nests. And I, on the spot, changed the focus of my PhD thesis because I realized that this was actually more interesting than what I had intended to study. So the birds kind of guided my research rather than the other way around. So these are the sort of 4 questions I'm going to address in this talk, but this talk will not be structured around these questions. I'll have a slightly different structure, but we're going to ask and look into these 4 topics. Why are coot chicks so colorful? Why do parents beat up their kids? Why do coots fight so much? And why do the females lay eggs in each other's nests? And they're all connected to kind of a strategy, a reproductive strategy. And so that's the focus of the talk, but as I said, not so much necessarily in that order. But I have to give you a bit of perspective. I'm a behavioral ecologist, which means I take an evolutionary perspective. And when I ask these questions, why are coot chicks colorful? Why do females lay eggs in each other's nests? I'm really asking, why is it adaptive for individuals to have those features or those behaviors? Why would doing what they do, being colorful, laying eggs in other birds' nests, why would that make you more adaptive than other individuals that don't do that? And so that's sort of the perspective I take. And just to give you a sense of what I mean, this is a classic question in bird biology, which is, how many eggs should a female lay? And early on, Darwin sort of got the perspective that we expect answers to questions like this to focus on the individual. Well, a female gannet here on the left, that's laying 1 egg is the best for her. And then sort of the questions got off the rails for a little bit, and then people started focusing on, oh, this is good for the species. Gannets are taking a hit. They're really looking out for the species. And that's the wrong perspective. If you're interested in natural selection, it's really the focus is on the individual. And we know that, I won't go through the details, but natural selection operates on individuals, and individuals that are better at leaving genetic descendants are favored. And so it's really about, the perspective here is not what's good for the species, but why would an individual benefit from doing this? It's really about individuals. And so we tag and follow a lot of individuals. And this famous British ornithologist, David Lack, sort of looked at this question from the perspective of number of eggs laid. And so he looked at European robins. I've got pictures of American robins, but we might ask the question, why do American robins lay 4 eggs? In many populations, all female robins lay 4 eggs. And the old-fashioned way of looking at this would have been said, because that's good for the robin species. the new sort of Darwinian way of thinking about this, or the modern version of Darwin, is that that's the optimal clutch size for an individual female, that she has a female robin that lays 4 eggs will leave the most genetic descendants, and that's what natural selection favors. A female that lays 3 eggs has fewer genetic offspring, leaving sort of descendants, and 5 is too many. They end up starving, etc. And so again, just this is sort of to highlight the perspective. So with that in mind, we're going to turn attention to the American Coots study, and this is where I did the work in central British Columbia. Here's Washington State. I don't know. Can you see my mouse? I think you can. Can you see the mouse moving around? Yes, good. Well, here's Williams Lake. That's sort of in south central British Columbia, and it's a fabulous part of British Columbia, open sort of parkland and lots of wetlands and lots of coots. So this is very high densities and a great area to study coots. So this is what the wetlands look like in early spring. Same bulrush we have right here in Central California, the California bulrush. And we're going to be talking mostly about coots, but because you're a naturalist and I don't want you to be completely bored, I'm going to give just a couple of slides of other birds found in the area. These wetlands are packed with birds, including lots of ducks, various grebe species, including this eared grebe carrying its babies on its back. Golden eyes, Barrow's golden eyes. It's a spectacular bird. So really, really rich and fabulous wetlands for watching lots of biodiversity. We'll focus on the coots eventually. And then even uplands, you get such charismatic species. This may be my favorite bird of all on planet Earth, great gray owls, fabulous, fabulous bird. So it's a really neat ecosystem, but we're going to take a myopic perspective and focus on just one species, the coot. So here's my outline. I'm going to talk a little bit just about methods, like how do we answer questions? What are we doing day to day in terms of collecting data and logistics? And then there'll be 3 sort of focuses on what the coots are doing, which is one is how to be a parent coot, how to raise their kids. And that's going to answer 2 of the 4 questions that I pose. One is why they fight so much and why they beat up their kids. That's all sort of embedded within how to be a good parent, not a nice parent, a good parent, a successful parent. And sort of related to that, after we've talked about why parents, how to be a good parent, that sort of will help us understand why chicks are so colorful. They're tapping into the behaviors that parents use to be good parents. And then finally, we'll look at why female coots lay eggs in each other's nests. And in some ways, that's basically how to avoid being a parent. Basically, you'll realize that it's costly being a parent. There's restrictions on being a parent. And so this is just a way to get somebody else to be a parent for your kids without you doing the work. So in terms of how to study coots, you have to find a good study area. I've hoped to study coots in California, but I can't find the densities, the number of birds in a wetland that I need to do my studies. British Columbia was phenomenal. The densities of coots on some of those wetlands were phenomenal. The downside is it's in the middle of nowhere. It was always tricky finding a place to work. So a really important challenge for doing ecological field work is finding a place where your animals are and finding a place where you can stay and live. I mean, it's a lot of work. We were putting in 16-hour, I talked about that, 16-hour work days. So you can't live based in a tent. And then we go out daily, basically check wetlands. The coots nest in these wetlands with a little bit of vegetation along the borders, which makes it nice. If you look at sort of wetlands in California, there's solid vegetation. What's nice about these wetlands is there's a thin border of vegetation, so you don't really have to look too hard to find nests. The nests are in this vegetation. And when you find a nest, we record the data. In the more recent version of our study, we recorded it on digital recorders, which was nice. So you go to nests, you count the eggs, you number them. It's basically, we're checking nests every day, numbering all eggs with Sharpies. Go to Ace Hardware, get your Sharpie, and basically the numbers stay on. So we're really taking a deep focused look at within each pair, within each territory, the eggs when they're laid and success. So you're basically looking at individual families, individual eggs, and individual chicks within families. For some years, we caught birds on some wetlands, not all years, but this was basically to make sure that we understood how many parents were involved and a little bit of measurements about them. So this is a homemade trap that has a trap door. The bird goes in and the door comes down, but the birds, we would trap them at night. They didn't like the traps. So after you put in a full 10-hour day monitoring nest, then you spend another 6 hours in the middle of the night, freezing cold. This is high elevation, trying to trap birds. So trapping was my least favorite part of the whole study, but it yielded important information. And we tagged birds because coots swim. You can't really put color bands on them. So I made these homemade neck collars and for a subset just to basically see what the individual parents are doing. But it turns out you can identify coots by sex by their voice. Males and females sound different, and they never leave their territory. So I realized after tagging them that I actually didn't need to tag them to be able to follow individuals. This is not the invasion of the mushroom people. This is a floating blind. Oh, hang on for a second. My stupid PowerPoint is trying to ruin my life. And so I'm gonna tell my PowerPoint that it can't do that by changing. Transitions. Oh no, okay, it's not the problem. PowerPoint's just being an idiotic thing. All right, where are we? It keeps advancing on its own, which is kind of drives me crazy. Oops, and then I need to share screen. All right, we're back at seeing, Dylan, you can acknowledge, yes, we're seeing this slideshow again. Yep, good, okay. So this is a tractor inner tube with the homemade structure on top, and we float around. You can actually float. You don't need to touch bottom. There's a seat, there's a platform. You can have your lunch, coffee, a data sheet. So we're basically spending 10 hours a day following marked broods. So it's intensive. We're actually really getting a lot of detailed information on broods. This is generation 2. These are almost invisible. We've had bald eagles sit on these while we're inside. So the birds, when these blinds are done well, it's like coasting around these swamps being invisible, and it's pretty phenomenal. This is taken with my normal lens. And so you can see I'm very, very close. I'm like 3 feet from this family, and it shows we tag individual chicks within broods by a unique color combination. It's a nape tag put through a tiny bit of skin on the back of the neck, and each chick in a brood gets its unique color, and we know which egg they hatch from. So we're really following those eggs to the individual chicks they hatch to their survival. So we know exactly which chick came from which egg and whether they survive, how much they're fed, how much they're beaten up. So it's really, really detailed in terms of what happens to eggs and chicks. So now I'm going to focus on one of the 3 remaining topics, and this is how to be a parent coot. First of all, they're pairs. There's no fancy mating system here. It's basically a pair of birds meet up, and it seems like they form pairs before they get a territory. They fight to establish a territory, and once they've got a territory, they fight. So these birds fight a lot. Basically, it's not a surprise to see many, many fights per day. They build the nest. Basically, both members, the male and female, share in all aspects of reproduction almost equally, except for the female lays the eggs. They defend the territory together, both fight, they feed, they both incubate and raise the babies. So it really is a full family endeavor. This is a typical coot nest. They lay fairly large clutches, anywhere from 8 to 10 is typical, but we've had clutches as small as 3 and as large as 15. From a given female, we'll see that because females lay eggs in nests, you can get bigger numbers of eggs in a nest, but eggs attributed to the owner of the nest, anywhere from 3 to 15. Once the chicks hatch, they're fuzzy and cute, just like a duckling, but they can't feed themselves. They are critically dependent on the parents for food for about 10 days. And here the parents dive under the water, and here's a larval damselfly, And so that's the weak link for the chicks in this whole thing, is they need food from mom and dad for the first 10 days. And without that food, they don't make it. And early on, when the chicks are really small, they line up and wait patiently. You can see 4 chicks in a line waiting their turns. But eventually, as the chicks grow, there is not enough food for everybody, and starvation is rampant. Coots overproduce. They lay more eggs than they can raise, and that's probably an adaptive strategy. 50% of all chicks in the population starve, and 90% of all families lose at least one chick, but some families lose very few chicks, and some families lose a lot of chicks. And we know that these chicks are dying because when we've monitored these territories carefully, we can find the dead chicks. They're not being taken by predators and eating. We can find them in the territory, and they are underweight. So we know that they did not get fed. And so this is a key feature of this system, is parents lay very optimistic clutch sizes, and then they cull the brood. So why do parents fight so much? So you can see these are not ritualized fights. These are serious fights. The birds bleed. They often go back to their nests and bleed on their eggs. Their claws, for their body size, are the size of raptors, and they're incredibly sharp. The first time I caught a coot in a trap, I didn't wear gloves, and I got my hands completely shredded. Their legs are sharp. And so these are serious fights, and they risk injury and death. When they're done fighting, and they fight with their, the interesting thing is, the textbooks tell us that territorial birds should not fight with their neighbors. They should fight with intruders that are trying to take over a territory. Coots forgot to read the textbook. They fight with their neighbors, and they fight all the time. And when they're done fighting, they have this little peace ceremony. We call it, hockey has face-offs. And because I'm a Canadian, and I thought that we should name this after hockey. So this is an ass off. They're showing each other their rear ends. They spin around and they show these special white feathers. These birds are mere inches apart. And what that line there between these birds indicates is that's the territory border. When they're done fighting, they are basically saying, okay, this is the territory border. And what's really amazing is they have the same fight every day at the same territory border, and it never seems to move. So it's kind of like it's like the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland. They fight to stay in the same place. And we can watch these fights from our floating blinds, and then we can sneak. This is fake, but we can basically go and attach flagging tape or forestry tape on the vegetation. And each time we see a fight, we can say, here's the territory border. And so this is a great way to measure territory size. And then you can say, they're fighting over territories. Does territory size matter? And it turns out that territory size is the only thing of about 30 variables I measured that predicts how many babies a pair will produce in a year, which is a measure of Darwinian fitness or reproductive success. This is what matters. If natural selection were operating on features, it would be based on who raises more kids than others. And so what I infer from this is they're fighting to hang on to their territories, because territories are everything. It's a direct connection to their reproductive success and their genetic lineages. And so natural selection has favored them to fight like crazy, to hang on to as big a territory as they can. And I infer that if they don't fight, that their neighbors may start to encroach on their territory. So they're fighting to basically hang on to what they've got. So that's speculation, but it kind of fits with this. And I should point out, the family remains within their territory for the entire season. Every scrap of food for the chicks is obtained within the territory. If those chicks stray from their territory, they will be killed by neighboring coots. If the parents leave the territory, they will be beaten up mercilessly from the neighbors. So basically the territory is where everything for that family. It's their everything. So they're fighting, and it's the resources for raising families, and we can measure that effect. Second question, why do coots beat up their chicks? I'm going to show you a video, but my stupid PowerPoint is making it so pixelated. It's the first time I've ever had this happen. I'm going to leave PowerPoint and then re-share with a different video projector because somehow, and I Googled and cannot find the solution to this, so bear with me. I've got them here ready. So I'm going to show you. Oh, hang on for a second. I need to share sound. That's pretty important because you want to hear the baby coot being screaming. So what I'm about to show you, can you see that sort of video of the coot? What you're going to see is a parent feeding its kids, and then all of a sudden something pisses it off and it starts chasing one of the chicks, grabbing it by the back of the head and shaking it. It's not pecking it, it's just shaking it. It's called tousling. It's like when your parents grab you by the head and shake you. And the chicks don't like it, but they're not really hurt. So it's just something that they really don't like, and it runs off screaming. So there. You can see the parent twisting its head really rapidly, and that kid's pissed off and saying, "Don't beat me up." That kid will go and stay away for a while. We're going to return to this because that chick, that was not just a random act of violence. That kid did something to deserve what it got. Humans shouldn't spank their kids, but for coots, it actually makes sense what they're doing. All right. So I will stop share, and then I will share screen again with PowerPoint. There we go. So to understand what's going on, you sort of have to understand the parental system. So many birds, including coots, stagger their hatching. And the way they do that is they don't, like a chicken or a duck will lay all its eggs, and only when all the eggs have been laid will it begin to sit on them so that all eggs get the same heat treatment. Things like owls and coots start sitting on their eggs and warming them as soon as they've laid them. So here's a shorted owl nest, and this is one family, and one chick is 2 weeks older than the other because the eggs were laid over a 2-week period, and the parent started incubating the eggs as soon as they were laid. And that creates a size hierarchy. And there's probably 15 hypotheses for why birds do that, but one clear pattern is there are real differences. When you have really big chicks and small chicks, their competitive abilities, their abilities to move, to compete for food from the parents, etc., are vastly different. So coots also do this. And so this is an actual cartoon of what happened at one nest, and it's pretty typical. So if you go to a coot nest, there might be 10 eggs, but on the first day, there might be 3 chicks that hatch. And then the next day, there might be 2 more chicks. And then day 3, 1 chick, day 4, 1 chick, day 5, 1 chick. This is a smallish brood, but you can get actually the typical hatching spread at coot nests is 5 days, and it can be as much as 8 days. So and when these first hatched chicks here hatch, they don't stay that size, they grow. So by the time this chick on day 5 is hatched, the older siblings are 4 or 5 days old. They're much, much bigger. So it creates a competitive and a size hierarchy. And this plays out in interesting ways because for the first 10 days of life, parent coots, basically, it's a first come, first serve. The family follows the parents around, and the parents are not choosy. They offer food, and whoever gets the food first gets to get fed. And guess who gets fed? There's big chicks and little chicks. So the big chicks are much more likely to get fed. And so in that first come, first serve phase, that's when the starvation happens. And the starvation is mostly the little late hatch ones. They're too small to basically keep up. And so we get this phase, it's called brood reduction. The full number of chicks that hatch don't make it. The brood gets winnowed down. Then roughly at about day 11, it varies from brood to brood. And of course, we're picking this up by patterns. We don't know exactly when a switch goes off, but there's a pretty sudden switch that goes off in the parents' brains where they stop this laissez-faire first come, first serve, and they take complete control. And they also have favoritism. So what happens is it's pretty complicated. They divide the brood up so that for the rest of the season, mom has her favorite chicks and she only feeds her chicks. Dad has his chicks and he only feeds those chicks. But the way they've divided the brood is non-random. They each take an oldest chick, a middle chick, and a youngest chick. And then what they do is they favor the hell out of the runts. Basically, they're trying to make up for a tone for all this what's gone on, and they favor the hell out of the young ones, and they specialize, they get fed. And the young ones actually grow so fast that they can sometimes outgrow their older siblings and get heavier. It's this weird thing. And it's really discreet, it's really clear. And it turns out that the punishment is how they achieve this. Because these guys, older guys, if it was first come, first served, they'd get all the food. The parents are using punishment to make sure that the little guys get the food intended for it. So I'm gonna again break out because the pixelation just drives me crazy. What I'm gonna show you a video of is, let's just see, share screen, share sound. Yeah, steal food. What I'm going to show you is a parent with its newly hatched, this chick, notice how orange it is. As the chicks grow, they get less orange because they don't grow new orange feathers. The orange comes from nutrients in the eggs, and as the chicks grow, they get less and less orange, as I'll show you in a second. And so what you're going to see is the parent dives down, gets food, and in the meantime, an older, larger, and grayer chick sneaks in just as the parent is about to feed this young guy, and the older chick steals the food. And the parent did not want to feed the older chick, so it punishes that chick for stealing food. So what the parents are using aggression for is to make sure that the little, less competitive guys get the food. And so that'll be very clear. And you'll see it's a bigger chicken, it's less colorful, and it steals food and it gets spanked. Boop. Oh, no, you don't. And this was work that my grad student, Dai Shizuka, took the lead on. And what we showed in our study was that once chicks are spanked, they stay away for a long time. So what the spanking does is it gives the parent breathing room to maintain control. And so the older guys are kind of playing the odds. It's like, how hungry am I? Is it worth trying to steal food and get spanked? So it's just like human family dynamics. It's actually pretty hilarious to watch. All right. Now I'm going to share the screen again with PowerPoint because I have not figured out the pixelation. All right. Now we're ready to understand a little bit about why chicks are so colorful, but I'll have to admit, this is still speculative. We've answered part of the question, but not all of the question. Many of you that are bird watchers realize that colorful plumages are often used in a mating context. If you look at mandarin ducks or wood ducks are found in Henry Cowell. The males are incredibly colorful and ornamented. And this is all about getting a mate. And so there's a large, Darwin came up with this idea of sexual selection and mating advantage. That can't apply to baby coots because they're trying to survive. They're too young to get mates and food is severely limiting. And so we wondered if the color might be connected to competition for food within families. And it turns out that there's a nice body of theory by a very fine biologist, Mary Jane West Eberhardt. And she came up with this idea called parental choice, which is analogous to mate choice. If you think about the wood duck, the reason the male wood duck is colorful is because females prefer colorful males as a mate. That's called mate choice. Mate choice favors the ornamentation. West Eberhardt realized that a similar phenomenon could happen within families if parents prefer ornamented kids and if there's winners and losers. And so the idea that she proposed, and there was no evidence to support this, she actually was working on bees and came up with this idea, and no one had ever tested it. And colleagues and I realized that it probably applied to American Coots. And her idea is this: if you have a system where parental food is critical to offspring survival, and if parents can control who gets fed and have a preference for more ornamented offspring, that will translate into a Darwinian advantage to the ornamented kids, because there's winners and losers in families. And if the ones that are more colorful are favored by their parents for whatever reason, that could cause natural selection for colorful ornamental plumage in kids. So we were focusing on this from the parent's perspective. And we were testing this idea. Do parent coots care about how ornamented their kids are? Is this the context in which this color makes sense? And so to test this, we did an experiment where within each brood, the orange feathers are not functional in terms of baby chicks are fuzzy. To keep warm, they have fuzzy feathers. And it turned out if you look under a microscope, the orange is a tip that extends beyond the fuzzy. And so if you trip the modified orange tip, you still get a fuzzy kid that looks like basically a normal chick. I don't know why my mouse is doing this, but it's driving me crazy. And so we presented parents with a mix of kids, equal 50-50 mix of normal ornamented chicks and then trim chicks that look more like ancestral coots. There are species of coots in Argentina, for example, that have chicks that look just like this. And so we're basically saying, do you care? And it turns out the parents care. It was actually a very striking pattern. If you give parents a mix, and note, this may sound cruel, but they're going to lose a lot of chicks to starvation. So what we're doing is we're not increasing the mortality rate of chicks. We're just playing God in which ones get to survive. So there was no extra chicks died from our experiment. We just got to determine which ones lived. And so we were just sort of tapping into this weird system where there are winners and losers. And it turns out that the ornamented chicks received more food, they grew faster, and they had higher survival. And the effect was not weak, it was overwhelming. So the take-home message here is parent coots really, really, really care about that their kids are ornamented. So this answers in some way why coot chicks are colorful, but it leaves unresolved the important question, like, why would parents care? And that's the harder question. So we showed that, yes, the color makes sense in terms of parental care and food in this weird system. But then to get at the why parents care, we returned to this study I told you about, where we show that parents have this second phase where they choose favorites. The favorites, recall, the favorites are often the youngest and the smallest. And so one possible explanation for why colorful plumage is favored, it may be an honest signal to the parents of which chicks are young or small, because this is the sort of projection of what happens to an average coot chick. It's born early on, it's very orange. Within about a week, it's lost most of its orange because the bird's grown tremendously. The same number of orange feathers have got diluted over a much larger body size, and they've started to fade. And so this could be a very honest and uncheatable mechanism where parents can say, okay, which of you guys needs the most help from me? It's a bit speculative, but we actually have shown that if you measure natural variation in color, we have a machine that measures actual color of orange. If you measure the variation in chicks within a brood, the most orange chicks are actually more likely to be chosen as favorites. So the pattern of color variation within broods actually supports that. Okay, and last but not least, this was actually the focus of my PhD. I stumbled on this within the first week of checking nests, and I realized it was a gold mine. I knew enough about the literature to know that this was an interesting phenomenon, and I realized that coots would allow me to answer a lot of questions that other study systems couldn't address. So out in the field, I changed the entire focus of my PhD to focus on this. The way we detect brood parasitism and the way I discovered it is you go to Nest Daily, you number eggs, and then all of a sudden you discover a couple of interesting patterns. So if you check a nest and then you find 2 eggs per day since yesterday, you know that 2 females have laid eggs because it is a physiological given for wild birds that females cannot lay more than 1 egg per day. An individual female bird at most will lay 1 egg per 24 hours. Many birds lay less than that. So if you're checking Nest Daily and you find 2 new eggs since yesterday, you know that physiologically there have to be 2 females laying eggs in that nest. So that was the bulk of my evidence, was just finding lots of cases where I was getting 2, 3, or 4 new eggs since yesterday. And then of course you look at the eggs and you can tell that one of them actually matches and one of them doesn't. And then occasionally, maybe 5% of the cases, you would get a pattern where let's say here's a female that lays 4 eggs, then she stops laying. Coots lay an egg a day, and then they stop. And so if you find new eggs way later in the season, after the female's done laying, you're pretty sure that another female has laid an egg. So those were the 2 criteria I used to determine that more than 1 female was laying eggs in a nest. Here's a real example. So here's 2 eggs that appeared on the same day. One of these looks like the rest, and one of these does not. And so whenever I discovered 2 eggs per day, I would compare the eggs and say which one looks like the rest and which one doesn't. I've cherry picked this example because it's extreme. If you look at this egg here, this is also a parasite by a different female. So 2 different parasites laid in this nest. This egg was laid the same day as this, but if you look at it, it's a bit shinier. The spots are different. So this brown egg is really extreme, but in many cases, it's less extreme. But if you really look at the patterns of variation, you can tell. And as I will show you in a second, female coots lay really consistent eggs. The same female coot, her eggs all look alike. And so when there's one that stands out that's different in shape, different in background color, different in spot color or density, once you've detected that there's 2 eggs laid per day or more, you can pretty much figure out which one belongs with the rest of the clutch and which one doesn't. And so this is probably the only data slide. Almost 50%, 40% of all nests received eggs from another female. So this was not a rare behavior. It was common. If things are really rare, you could attribute it to an accident. Like if 1% of the nest got an egg from another female, you could say, okay, there's some mixed up females here, but 40% of the nests are getting eggs from other females. And 13% of all eggs laid in the population end up in somebody else's nest. This is common enough to be interesting. And so I figured it was worth studying. And so we'll go back to Darwin. Is like, why would this be adaptive for a female to lay eggs in the nest of another female? Or to put another way, why does laying eggs parasitically increase the female's lifetime production of babies over what she would get if she didn't lay parasitically? That's the key question. Why does this increase the number of genetic descendants she leaves? Because that's the game. If a female engages in parasitism, she's going to outcompete non-parasites, and then that strategy will everybody will pursue that strategy because it's favored by natural selection. And I should point out, females are not aware of what they're doing. It doesn't have to be that they're smart and going, oh, I'm going to figure this out. They just have to have a brain that makes it pleasurable. It's like a female goes, oh, I want to go lay an egg in somebody else's nest. So they don't have to be self-aware. For adaptation, humans are self-aware. Organisms don't have to be. They just have to be programmed to do stuff that works. One important question is, this is another bird that you have up in Henry Cowell. If you were to find an acorn woodpecker nest, it's quite common to find 2 females laying eggs in the same nest. And so a really important question early on was to show that coots are not acorn woodpeckers. Acorn woodpeckers live in groups. And mothers and daughters will often share a nest. What I found though, by my tagging study, is you only ever have a pair of coots in a territory. So it was not, these were not acorn woodpecker family group style things. These parasitic females were not part of the family group. They were sneaking in and laying eggs. So to figure out why females lay parasitically, you have to figure out who are the brood parasites. And to do that, I took advantage of the fact that there's tremendous variation among females in their egg features. These are eggs from lots of different females. And you can see variation in shape. Size is not so good because females will, an individual female will lay different sized eggs, but shape, background color, sheen, the size of spots, the density of spots, and the color of spots are all very good indicators of which females laid eggs, because females are very consistent in those characteristics. So here's eggs laid by 5 females. Each column are eggs, 5 egg samples taken from a female, and you can see within a column, the eggs all look really, really similar in terms of shape, background color. Here's a runty egg that's more pear-shaped, it's white. Here's an egg with bigger spots, and here's an egg with bigger spots and darker background. And so this allows us in the field to visually compare eggs and figure out who laid them. So here's Jason, field assistant. What he's got in that egg carton are parasitic eggs from various nests, and he's carrying them around the marsh to see if he can find a match. Can he find an egg? So here's a parasitic egg, and in Jason's egg carton, he might have this parasitic egg, and then he takes it around the marsh and compares it to eggs in other nests. What this allows you to do is to identify the parasite if the parasite has a nest. It only works if the parasite has a nest, and we'll return to that point. So here's what Jason might have done. He might have gone to this nest and gone, does that look like a match? Not really. Does that look like a match? Nope. Does that look like a match? Yes. And what's interesting is this cartoon actually encapsulates something that turned out to be biologically true, which is in 90% of the cases where the parasite actually had a nest, she was a next door neighbor. The apple does not fall far from the tree. We did not have to go very far. Sometimes it was 2 territories, occasionally farther, but basically it's neighbors strategically keeping tabs on each other and then darting in and laying an egg in their neighbor's nest when they get a chance. And so who are the parasites? Based on that massive egg check, we were able to attribute 75% of the eggs that we determined that were laid by brood parasites to nesting females. So these are females that had their own nests. 25% of the parasitic eggs, we could not find a match in the population, and we assumed that those females did not have a nest of their own. And these are called floaters. It's well known. This is actually a photograph because these birds are territorial. I just told you how territorial these birds are. They pack in at enormous densities. Coots nest at densities 10 times higher than you predict for their body size. Coots are so abundant that there just is not enough turf for everybody. And some females and some males do not get a territory. And so they basically hang out in areas away from nesting territory. Here's an island with no good nest territory. There were groups of birds there. These are floaters. Some of these might have been brood parasites. So it turns out that the answer to why females lay parasitically depend on who the parasite is. It's a different answer for these 2 flavors of brood parasites because they have different costs and benefits. So I'm going to start with why non-territorial females lay eggs in the nests of others, and it actually makes intuitive sense. The habitat full, there are no territories at all. And so what these females are doing is they have 2 options: to sulk and do nothing, or try to eke out a little bit of reproductive success. And basically, if they had a bumper sticker, it would say, I'd rather be nesting, but they can't nest. They're young, probably. And so this is called basically what Richard Dawkins referred to as making the best of a bad situation, or the common saying, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. So for these guys, their lemons are, they didn't get a territory. And so their lemonade is, I'm going to get something as opposed to nothing by laying eggs in somebody else's nest. So it's a backup plan. And all females can do it. So basically, females go through life. And if you end up in this situation in your first year, I can't get a territory, this is a backup plan. And it augments your number of kids produced in your lifetime over what a sulker would do is like, if I don't get a territory, I'm not doing anything. And so Darwinian natural selection loves this kind of flexibility. Darwinian selection loves lemonade. Basically, when put in this situation, you should basically make the best of it. This question, why females with their own nests lay eggs in the nests of others, is a little harder because they've got their own damn nest. Why don't they just lay eggs in their own nest? And if you've been paying attention, you'll realize, aha, it kind of makes sense. But before I get there, I'm going to talk about some biology, and then I'll talk about why it makes sense, why they don't lay those eggs in their nests. 25% of all females in the population that have nests also lay eggs in the nests of others. I said that 75% of brood parasitic eggs are nesting females. That's from the parasitic egg perspective. Now I'm saying from the population of nesting females, 1 in 4 nesting females will lay some of her eggs in the nest of a neighbor. They'll lay anywhere from 1 to 10 eggs. They typically lay 3 eggs. The average is 3 eggs, and they almost always lay their parasitic eggs before they begin their own nest and in a continuous sequence. I think what they're doing is they're being opportunistic. They're about to lay. They could start laying in their own nest. They look at their neighbor and they go, you know what, that looks pretty inviting. I think I'm gonna dump some eggs and then I'll start nesting. And they parasitize neighbors. And so here's a real case history. This is a true female in cartoon form. This female laid 3 eggs in one of her neighbors. She laid another 2 eggs in another neighbor, and these are sequentially. And then she laid eggs in her own nest. And these are all eggs laid one after the other. And so this also, the fact that when we match up eggs, if we look at the laying schedules, it also makes sense. These eggs are all chock-a-block laid one at a time. It all makes sense, both from the visual matching of eggs and from the laying schedule. So this might be May 1, May 2, May 3, May 4, May 5, May 6, May 7, May 8. So what we think they're doing is, if conditions are good, they've got neighbors that are ahead of them. They feel they can lay lots of eggs. They can actually get access to the nest. So why not? Let's try and lay some parasitic eggs before we lay in our own nest. And what this also tells you is these females are producing extra eggs to lay parasitically. They're not cutting back on their own family size. This is gravy. Those eggs don't do great, but it's great. These are freebies. Those 5 eggs, they just have to lay the eggs. They don't have to care for the kids, listen to the whining. They don't have to beat them up, none of that stuff. And coots are prolific egg layers. They can lay a boatload of eggs. Some females can lay 30 eggs in 30 days. So eggs are quite cheap for these birds. And I think this strategy of dumping them on their neighbors reflects that. And I already told you this. Here's an example. So parasites are producing extra eggs to lay parasitically. They're not just swapping eggs out of their own nest to lay. So this is, as I said, gravy. And that means that if these any kind of babies, even if it's low, that's extra. They didn't have to do anything other than produce those eggs. And so as long as the benefit from having somebody else raise those kids exceeds the cost of laying those eggs, Darwinian selection will reward it. What's good for the parasite is bad for the host. So very briefly, just a couple more slides, then we'll wrap up. If you put it all together, there's lots of starvation. Birds can't raise all of their own kids. So the last thing they want to do is raise somebody else's. Whenever you end up raising somebody else's kid, you've basically sacrificed one of your own. So there's a whole other side of this I won't go into. That's the recipients, the hosts that raise somebody else's kids, they fight back. They fight back in a variety of ways, but one of the most dramatic ways they fight back is they actually know their own eggs in many cases, and they will get rid of the foster eggs. So here's a nest. Come back a few days later, those eggs are getting pushed down in the nest and buried. They will not be incubated. They will not hatch. Some 30% of all parasitic eggs get kicked out by the host. They're different enough. I've shown that they'll often use background color, but there's probably other things. So they're using visual cues to say, those aren't mine. So I'm going to get rid of them. And there they go. All right. So let's wrap up. I hope that you may not have ever thought about coots before, but if some of you have thought about coots, you probably thought those were the boring gray birds on wetlands, and let's move on and see something more interesting. So I hope I've convinced you that next time you see a coot, slow down. And if they have kids, by all means, try and see their kids, because not many birds have fluorescent orange babies. And just be aware that these seemingly boring and stupid birds are really rather complicated and have some really sophisticated parental care strategies that I think are phenomenally interesting. And coots may be a little bit more interesting than most birds, but I've never worked on a bird and started looking at it in detail that I haven't discovered something really fascinating. So it's like, don't jump to assumptions about birds. Pay attention to the details, start watching them and learn about their natural history, because you'll make discoveries, as I did. You can make discoveries on your own about some really interesting natural histories. And so that's the end of this story, but I want to end with just a couple of slides. I'm going on sabbatical this year, which means I get a break from teaching to start a brand new project in Argentina with some Argentina colleagues. Basically, I've spent 10 years looking at American coots. There's 5 other species of coots in South America, and some of them do things dramatically different. So I'm kind of interested to take this framework that I've adopted to thinking about American coots and looking at what pictures of the story I've just told you apply to other species and which ones are different. And I went a few years ago, just as a pilot study, to northern Argentina with some colleagues to work on some coots down there. And it's a fabulous, fabulous place. There's, as I said, several species of coots, lots of flamingos. And here's my Argentinian colleagues scanning for coots. This is actually, unlike American coots, this is a highly endangered species. It's the size of a small Canada goose, nests at 4,000 to 5,000 meters in the Andes. And they seem to be doing some things the same as American coots and some things very, very different. The thing that caught my attention is their chicks are jet black. Their chicks look just like the experimental trim coot chicks that I showed you. So that to me is a really interesting thing. Is like, wow, that's pretty interesting. These guys do not have ornamented chicks. We suspect that they may not have brood parasitism. They may not have, they have very small clutches. So it seems like we're basically going to do all of the same sort of logistic and methodological approaches for American coots to just find out from a basic natural history perspective what this enigmatic sort of Andean coot species is up to. So I'm looking forward to that. So maybe in the future, there'll be a talk about that work for you guys as well. All right, I think that's it. And I am happy to take questions.
Yes, Bruce.
Robert.
Yeah, very much appreciate your talk and how well you were able to connect the dots with Darwinian selection and so forth. And so one question, when you were talking about the experiment with cutting the tips, the colorful tips off the chicks, and the idea that they seem to be selecting for the bright plumage. Could that also be a selection for, because they're deviating from maybe their own expectation of their own chicks? And yeah. So I was thinking of an alternative experiment where you could actually add coloration or increase the brightness of the chicks and see if they also reject those.
Well, they might not reject the, there's many cases where if you create more extravagant versions that they actually like them. Your question is a great one, and I think I can answer that because we anticipated this. I didn't talk about this, but we did 2 controls to accompany our experiment. For some parents, we gave them only trimmed chicks. And we also had controls where we didn't trim any. The idea was if they don't like trimmed chicks, then those broods should do worse. But it turns out that it's relative. If parents only have trimmed chicks, they're totally happy with them. It's really, and so that showed if you compare the average number of chicks produced in when all the chicks are trimmed or all are orange. You look at the average feeding rate and you look at the average growth rate, they're identical. It's only when the parents have a choice to make. And so it's relative. So the parents basically will say, I'm happy to take any coot, but I like the one that's the most orange. So I don't know if that gets at your question, but we had anticipated that basically we were doing something weird because, you know, and if you've ever seen a baby coot, it would be really hard to make them more orange. They are so freaking orange. You would be hard pressed to make them more orange. But what we actually want to do is maybe work with one of the mascara companies that makes waterproof mascara, see if they'll make us a bright orange mascara and see if horned coots have a built-in preference for orange chicks, because there's an idea out there in evolutionary biology that in some species, there's a preference in place, even though the trait isn't there. So we would test that with horned coots to say, if you evolved orange chicks, would you like them better? And so we're thinking of some kind of mascara, some waterproof orange mascara on their chicks to see if that preference is latent, but the chicks have not evolved to be orange. One reason that horned coot chicks might not be orange is there's nowhere to hide. If you look at those wetlands, there's no vegetation, there's gulls. And so the risk of predation may be extreme, and it may be that the chicks just can't afford to have anything that makes them stand out. But that's a great question, Robert. Yes, SCQM. That's probably not your real name.
I'm sorry that I forgot to rename. I'm Ellie. I've never seen a baby coot. And where in Santa Cruz and what time of year or time of day might I go and perhaps see some?
Well, any small wetland, I think Henry Cowell, the wetland up by the train place may have a coot. A lot of these little tiny marshes have a single pair. The problem in Santa Cruz, I wrote a paper about this. I showed my wife her first baby coot at Westlake Pond, and it had just hatched, and it came off the vegetation at there's a place called Westlake Pond, and I think it had hatched within a few hours. And as soon as it hit the water, a bass took it. And the coots at Westlake Pond almost never, ever, ever raise babies. Whereas grebes that carry their babies, and so the babies would not be vulnerable to bass, grebes are always successful at Westlake Pond. Coots are almost never successful. And I've noticed this comment on eBird. And so you may have to see them pretty fast or try to see coots on wetlands or tiny ponds that aren't stocked with bass. And so, yeah, I'm trying to think. Do you live in the Santa Cruz area?
Antonelli Pond, maybe?
Antonelli Pond would probably have them, Swanton Pond. So any of those ponds, if you check them regularly, I know that, I don't know if Antonelli has coots breeding. They probably should. Certainly Swanton, I've seen broods. And I haven't paid enough attention to know what time of year, but it's probably getting close. Yeah, so any small body of water with fringing vegetation, if you see a pair of coots on at this time of year, you should be watching out for chicks. But if you send me an email, just Google Lyon Lab at UCSC, you'll find my email. You can send me your name, and then if I come across some, I can then let you know. If I'm like, I occasionally check Westlake or something, and so if I stumble on some, I could let you know. But they're worth seeing because they're bizarre. And if you look at them close up, they've got highly modified. I mean, the feathers, they've got little, like if some of you are birders and know cedar waxwings with their globs of colorful things, the facial plumes on the coot chick are similar. They're just globs of feather material. It's not like a normal feather. So they're highly modified. This really is life and death for baby coots.
I really like their feet, the grown-up ones. They're
Yeah.
so colorful. Yeah, they don't look so colorful until they get out of the water and walk around, and they have amazing feet.
Yeah.
Dr. Lyon, do you know if there is any correlation between the hatchlings, the success rate of the hatchlings, and other invasive species like red-eared sliders and bullfrogs?
No idea whatsoever. I think coots, coots attack lots of things like grebes and ducks. I think coots are pretty good at trying to chase things from their territory that might eat food that competes with them. I don't know what sliders and other things, what they eat, whether it's aquatic invertebrates. The aquatic invertebrates are really what the chicks need. So anything that would be eating that as a diet would be competing with the coots for food for their chicks. Parents eat vegetation. And I think parents will eat pond scum. It's amazing, that sometimes you see a pond with like green scum on the top. Parent coots love that. And so I think one of the things that plays into this system is the parents are making eggs out of really hyperabundant food, pond scum, but then those eggs, when they hatch, have to be fed meat, invertebrates. So there's a disconnect between how cheap the eggs are to make and then how expensive the babies are to raise. And so I think that a little bit plays into the brood parasitism story.
Yeah, that's interesting. I ask because the ponds at Roaring Camp, that chain of small 3 ponds up there, they're overrun with bullfrogs and sliders. And I've only been at Cal for 3 years, but I see one coot routinely every time I walk up there, but I've never seen a pair. And I was wondering, I'm always curious.
Bullfrog, did you say bullfrogs would eat everything? So I think bullfrogs would eat,
So is it possible that here at Roaring Camp, the coots will come outside of breeding season since they forage on plant matter, as you said? And
they might, but it might be too small. Coots in winter really, really love to be in big groups. Like they're territorial in summer, but then they form big groups. So Westlake Pond, there'll be a couple hundred. And if you go to the Merced Wildlife Refuge in the Central Valley, there can be thousands. It's fun to watch because the eagles and bald eagles learn to hunt coots when coots aggregate. So you can see some pretty great spectacles.
Yeah, Dr. Lyon, one other question is there, can you speak to maybe a relationship between territorial, the strength of territories with a bird species and how likely it is that they'll parasitize a different nest? I sent Dylan a video, I think a week ago or so, of a robin that was right outside my kitchen window, and I like at 6:30 in the morning, I heard this banging, and I said, "What the heck is that?" And I got up, went in the kitchen, and this robin kept attacking my my kitchen window, and apparently he was going after his mirror image as a rival, thinking that was a rival. And as you pointed out, I guess that robins will lay 4 eggs, and they don't tend not to parasitize their neighbors. Is that right? So I just wondered if there's some relationship between the territorial aggressiveness of protecting a territory, and maybe that keeps parasitic neighbors out of their territory more. And
well, that's been the argument. It's a good point. It doesn't seem to work very well in coots. I actually don't think there's a pattern. There's a lot of birds that are not territorial that are colonial, and some people have said that lack of territoriality favors parasitism, but I think there's a good mix. So I think birds, for whatever reason, are able to evade the territoriality. I think density is important. Coots, although coots are territorial, the density is almost like a colony, and birds can collect information about what their neighbors are doing. And so I think that people have said, oh, colonial birds have more hosts and they're not territorial, but it's more just I think the density may be a more important factor, because more hens in Europe. I'm trying to think of what else. It's especially rampant in waterfowl. Waterfowl tend to not be territorial, except like some species like goldeneye are territorial on the brood lakes, but they defend a nest box, but it's not a classic territory. I don't think what else. So it occurs in grebes, ostriches, a lot of waterfowl. It's common in starlings, weaver birds, rails are the groups mostly where it's particularly common. And I don't see any particular pattern there. But it's a good question. People have discussed it, but I don't think it's a decisive factor.
Yeah, and did I read this correctly? And so recollect reading about cuckoo birds, which typically, lay their eggs in even other species of birds. And then when they hatch, they're generally bigger than the host bird in the nest, and they'll actually push the other eggs out of the nest, which is...
Yeah, cuckoos are what are called obligate parasites. There's 100 species of birds that never have their own nest, which means by definition, they have to depend on other species. That includes cowbirds. With a colleague at Davis, we worked on a duck in Argentina that's like a cuckoo. Its main hosts are coots. So this has evolved 7 times. There's now 100 species. In the cuckoos, the baby is not originally bigger, it's smaller, but it hatches faster, it evicts all the eggs, and then it grows. And it grows to be like 3 times the body size of its parents, but when it hatches, it's small. So it kicks out all the host eggs and babies, and then grows like crazy because it monopolizes all the food that would normally go to a family of 4. So yeah, that's correct.
Dr. Lyon, your time has been invaluable. I've already made a note to myself to walk up to the ponds tomorrow and try to observe some of these behaviors. And I would love to take you up on your offer to alert us if you do see some chicks nearby.
Sure. I can actually let you know then, because then you can let other people know. Yeah.
That would be fantastic. And thank you in advance so much.
Yeah. Hey, if you see green herons, because green herons often nest at those ponds at Roaring Camp. So if you see green herons, let me know, because I've been up there a few times. Sometimes they've nested right in the open, which is pretty fun.
Yeah, I saw a pair actually, like 2 weeks ago, maybe.
At those ponds?
Mm-hmm.
They probably got a nest, and in the past, like 10 years ago, I saw a nest that was in the reeds, I think.
Okay.
It's kind of fun. Yeah.
Maybe you should take us out birding around those ponds sometime.
Sure.
Thank you, Dr. Lyon. Thank you so much. That was brilliant.
All right. Thank you guys for inviting me.
Thank you.
I'm going to stand for a little bit, everyone.
Thanks.
If you have follow-up questions too, you can email me. I'm always happy to talk about coots. If anybody has anything that they think about in the middle of the night, just send me an email.
Sounds good.